Well, hello everyone, my name is Nick, and today we're going to spotlight 7 unusual, but easy to find and inexpensive trailing houseplants. Very specific today, but who doesn't love trailing houseplants? They're such a wonderful addition to every home, and along with large statement plants, I think they are essential for achieving the indoor jungle vibe. So like I said, we're going to touch on 7 today, each belonging to their own genus of houseplants, and I feel very confident that all of these, you could walk into like any small-owned plant store or nursery, and you would find, I would say, every single one of these pretty easily. Probably not at a big box store, but any privately owned plant store, I feel very confident you can walk in and find at least 5 out of the 7 of these. So the first one we're going to talk about today, I'm overwhelmed because all of them are so exciting to me. Let's talk about this one right here. So this is a Rhipsalis ewaldiana. And I've touched on quite a few different Rhipsalis here on my channel in the past couple of years, but I feel like this is one I've never really touched on. This one has just been kind of like a filler Rhipsalis in my home, and I can tell that I do not pay as much mind to this plant either because this thing is covered in dust, at least all the old growth on this houseplant. So when I purchased this, it was just this little bit that's like coming out of the pot right here, like this and this bit right here. And then over the last, I'd say, 2 years, it really didn't even start growing, I'd say, until the last year. It was a little bit of a slow start. It spat out these like long vines that then spit out all this growth at the bottom. And that's what Rhipsalis mainly do. So if you are purchasing Rhipsalis small, which I would recommend because they are ridiculously inexpensive as a small size, I think I paid like $3 for this tiny little Rhipsalis when I purchased it. So if you are looking for like a robust plant to begin, I would probably recommend purchasing like 2 or 3 of the same Rhipsalis and shoving them in the same pot when you repot it, because it's not really going to fill out at the base over time unless you're actively propagating it, which you absolutely can do. But the way that they put off new growth is very interesting and gangly and dynamic, let's say. There are plenty of adjectives to describe this new growth. It's a little different than what many of you are probably expecting or looking for in a trailing houseplant, but when this is a more full plant, it really is quite something, and it really does provide a little bit of difference, juxtaposition, if you will, amongst the other houseplants in our home that are mainly foliage-based. And I do want to give you a couple tips for purchasing Rhipsalis. I mean, I gave you one already about maybe it's best if you find them inexpensive to purchase a couple and shove them in a planter altogether to give an illusion of a fuller houseplant, although it's not really an illusion because it is a fuller houseplant. Y'all know what I mean. But another important thing I would say about Rhipsalis is to purchase them small. I think you're going to save a lot of money when you buy them small. At least back when I was in the industry, which obviously has been like a year and a half now, so take this with a grain of salt. Rhipsalis, when they were full grown, like if I bought them in a 6-inch like hanging basket or larger, they were ridiculously expensive in comparison to the small like 4-inch pots or like 2-inch pots of Rhipsalis that were very, very inexpensive in comparison. Like I said, I purchased this for like $2-3, but if you purchased a large, already good to go, like starting to trail basket of this Rhipsalis in like a 6-inch or 8-inch hanging basket, I wouldn't be surprised if that's like $75 to $100 just from the way that the wholesale prices were. So it could be different place to place. Some places could also be growing them themselves or buying them from a better retailer. I'm just basing this off my own knowledge back when I was in the industry. But unless you're just like head over heels for a Rhipsalis that you find, if it's large or if it's a good deal, I would recommend just going for smaller Rhipsalis. They do take a little time to get going, but they are very rewarding plants to grow. They're perfect filler plants. They don't require a lot of sunlight. Obviously, the foliage would grow in a little thicker if I was growing this under higher light conditions, but keeping in mind this was growing in like a small owned greenhouse when I purchased it, I wasn't expecting it to put out these plump, succulent leaves right here, and I'm perfectly happy with these like little stickier ones right here. They still have the same definition and like just characteristics of these leaves here. I'm starting to ramble about this Rhipsalis here, but it really is quite wonderful. But definitely keep an eye out in like that miscellaneous succulent and cactus selection that every single houseplant store has for some Rhipsalis, because that's where you're going to find the best specimens that are the most inexpensive, at least in my own experience or in my area of the United States. And speaking of the succulent and cactus selection, let's discuss next this Kalanchoe, or Kalanchoe, however you would like to pronounce it. This is a Kalanchoe fedtschenkoi. I don't know how to pronounce this plant. This is like the most gibberish looking species name of any houseplant I grow in my home. But I wanted to talk about this today because I feel like there are a handful of Kalanchoes out there that perform very well as trailing houseplants. Another example, which I absolutely love, but unfortunately do not have in my home right now, is Kalanchoe uniflora. A fantastic trailing houseplant, definitely gives me more of like a Hoya or a Peperomia vibe. This one is a little bit more aggressive in the way that it grows. So you can see if I had this in a larger pot, it would probably be creeping along the surface of the plant and just like rooting its way in and growing along, and then continuing to grow upright as it is right here inside the planter. But since I have this in such a small planter, it's just been working its way out and performing as a trailing houseplant. And I think it's so super fun. It has a lot of character. The foliage is gorgeous. I have this growing in an east-facing window and it's holding onto its color very well, which is just like this beautiful, just like mermaidish color. I don't know how else to describe it. It just reads like mermaid tail to me. It's just freaking gorgeous. And Kalanchoes are practically unkillable. If you've grown like the classic mother of thousands Kalanchoe in your home, or if you live in an area where it's like a weed out in your garden or something, you are familiar with how unkillable Kalanchoes are. So maybe you're even second guessing growing this one because of that, but I really, really enjoy it. In fact, this was just a piece I'm pretty sure I found on the ground when I was at work back at the plant store. I just shoved it in this little planter because I thought, why not? And it has exploded over the last couple of years into this. I think it was just one plant. I don't even know how this started out, but it is now just like this mess, this total mess of just everything gorgeous and lovely. Wouldn't necessarily refer to this as a lush houseplant. I know sometimes we're looking for more like beautiful, leafy, lush, gorgeous houseplants when we're looking for trailing houseplants. So perhaps I'll talk about one of those next. So one of the best examples of an unusual trailing houseplant that's really going to give you those lush, jungly vibes is this right here. This is a Cissus rhombifolia. I believe this is the Danica variety. So this is the oak leaf variety. So commonly referred to as the oak leaf ivy, or the oak leaf cissus. There's another variety that's very closely related. That's the grape leaf variety. So the grape leaf ivy, they call it, or the grape leaf cissus. You'll likely find both the grape and the oak leaf varieties sold in tandem at your local houseplant stores, as wholesalers tend to sell the grape and the oak leaf interchangeably in the same trays. So just something to note there. And this is really just like a completely underrated houseplant. I'm sure if I've done underrated houseplant videos before, this is in probably a couple of them, because this thing deserves more attention and it's not getting the attention that it deserves to this day. I think a plant that's very comparable to this in appearance is English ivy, and that is probably the one that people are going to reach for over this one just because they're more familiar with it, or maybe they prefer those vibes. I can't grow English ivy. I used to not even sell it at the houseplant store that I worked at because every single time they would arrive covered in spider mites. I've never met an English ivy that doesn't have like spider mites or scale or something on it. So that's why I opt for the Cissus rhombifolia. And while this will perform extremely well as a trailing houseplant, it'll also perform very well as a climbing houseplant. So that's why I have it in this planter here with this jute rope as this houseplant begins growing. I've only had this one for like 6 months, so it's still taking some time, but you can see it's got a bunch of new growth coming in now that we're entering the spring season. Very exciting. As the new growth goes, it'll just start to try to find something to grab onto. If it doesn't find anything, it'll begin to trail. If it does find something, it'll start to climb up and just grab onto whatever it finds and hold on for dear life. And it's actually quite wonderful. I've grown a couple other type of cissus in this manner, and they climb up all the way to the top, and then once they get to the top, they just spill forward, and it's just, it's such a lush vibe. Definitely an unsung hero of the houseplant world. Deserves so much more attention, but doesn't require that much attention. This is a very easy houseplant. I have it just in this terracotta planter here in a standard mixture with some perlite, and if I'm not watering this enough, it'll wilt for me. And it perks back up every time. It's not really been a houseplant where if it wilts, it loses the leaves. I'm sure if you let this thing stay wilted a little too long, some of the leaves might crisp up and turn brown or turn yellow and fall off after rewatering, but I don't know. I feel like I let this thing get like near death a couple of times, and I think it still looks absolutely lush and gorgeous. In fact, I'm kind of surprised how lush it looks. But anyway, super incredible houseplant. Ridiculously inexpensive. You're not gonna find like a lush version of this houseplant for like more than like $20 maximum for like a full ass plant. A small plant shouldn't cost you anywhere from like $5 to $10. But I found a couple years ago. It's like giant, ridiculously huge hanging basket. It was so gorgeous. It was like $15, maybe even $10. It was the steal of the century, in my opinion. I put it up on a giant trellis. It was gorgeous. But when I moved to the apartment here, I left it at the old apartment for a full month, and it did completely crisp up and die. So a month is definitely too long, but a week without water is probably fine. A month is definitely too long. I can say that from experience. Let's talk about this next. Well, I'm just finishing up what I have on my left here. So this is a Hoya Lacunosa. Hoyas are known for being incredible trailing houseplants, but I wanted to talk about Hoya Lacunosa today because this was, when I worked at the houseplant store at least, this was like a very common Hoya. I would get it in every week, but it was the Hoya that sold the worst. I would say even sold worse than just your standard Hoya carnosa, which like when people would ask if I had Hoyas in stock and I said I had carnosa, they were just like disappointed every time, which is a great Hoya. I love carnosa and I love lacunosa. I think it's fantastic. And I understand that the reason it was probably passed over most is because it's not as overwhelming when it comes to the foliage. I know people are loving some foliage on some Hoyas. Some have like that wonderful venation, some have beautiful variegation, some have large leaves or long leaves or what have it. Hoya lacunosa's foliage is admittedly a little less exciting than some of the others, but what this houseplant has going for it that many other Hoya don't is this one blooms so easily. Here's a cluster of blooms that's coming in right now. I also have a decent amount of new growth coming on this houseplant. It's been an easy grower for me. I had a much larger specimen before, but obviously I'm kind of pressed on space here in my new apartment. So when I did end up getting this one, I believe from Steve's Leaves in like the past 6 months or so, I ended up giving my larger specimen to one of my friends because why not start small all over again? It's a super easy houseplant to grow, and I don't know, I felt more of a connection with the smaller one than I did to the big one. I don't know, I just really enjoyed it. Anyway, that's a me thing. I don't even know why I'm talking about that. I just really wanted to point out that this is a really great Hoya. It blooms very easily, easier than any other Hoya I grow in my home. Maybe my multiflora, which I have right behind me here, is also a top contender for that spot, but I would say they're tied. The flowers smell nice. They smell kind of like cinnamon. I think this is called like the cinnamon scented wax plant. It's cinnamony, it's floral. It can catch you off guard. I have many of times walked into my room not realizing that my Hoya lacunosa was blooming and thought my cat peed for a second, and I'm looking around until I realize what I'm smelling. So it smells good, mostly good is the way to describe it. But it's a really great Hoya, super easy to grow, super easy to bloom. I think it has everything going for it. It just doesn't have that incredible foliage that some people are looking for. But on the contrary to that, I would argue that once this houseplant is trailing and just like spilling over the edge, I adore the way the foliage looks. Like the way these little just like teardrop shaped leaves just spill over. It's such a vibe. I love it. It doesn't get enough attention. It's definitely a Hoya that is passed over. At least it was at the store that I worked at. So I feel the need to express some love for it today. And let's discuss this one right here. Now this is not a hard to find houseplant at all. I would consider this unusual for trailing houseplants though, because, well, I will get there. This is a Peperomia tetragona, also referred to as the Peperomia petiolata, commonly referred to as the parallel Peperomia or the Distilled Pepperomia. So this is one, you're gonna find this everywhere. It's gonna be dirt cheap. It's a fantastic Peperomia. I purchased this as a super small plant probably like 3 years ago. And you can see the older growth is becoming a little chlorotic since I've moved to this apartment. It's been frying a little bit. You can see like it's got a little bit of yellow. It's totally fine. The leaves aren't popping off like that kind of yellow where they're like, if I just touch them, they fall off. It's just from some sun damage. But as this has acclimated to its space over time, you can see the new growth has got that similar color that you're used to seeing in the houseplant stores. Also, here's a great example right here, all this new growth that's coming out of the base of the plant. And I wanted to talk about this one today. Like I said, it's not hard to find. I wouldn't even really consider this to be an unusual houseplant. But every single week when I worked at the plant store, someone would just bring one of these up to the counter, just like from the selection that I had, put it on the counter, and then say, I have a question about this plant. I've been growing this for a couple of months now. It's been growing really well for me, and it's been growing upright, and once the leaves get too high, they're falling over. How do I get them to stay upright? Because as the way you purchase this, it's just growing upright. Typically, you wouldn't consider it to be a trailing houseplant. But as it continues to grow and gets heavy, as many houseplants do, it trails down and it will become quite the specimen of a trailing houseplant. Like I said, this is just purchased from a small, like 2-inch pot that I got a couple of years ago, and it really fills out well. And peperomias across the board do this. There's like two main types of peperomias. There's like the thick, succulent stemmed, upright growing peperomias that don't trail. A great example of that would be, do I have any behind me? I do have one. This Peperomia Fuzzy Mystery is great. Also Peperomia obtusifolia, but I cannot reach that right now. So just to give you an example of a different peperomia than this. So yeah, I really just wanted to discuss this one today because I feel like if you asked a plant enthusiast to list all the trailing peperomia that come to mind, I think they would list like 30 peperomia before they think about Peperomia tetragona. And that's mainly because of the way that it's just seen sold in houseplant stores. In fact, I've seen some that are just like so juiced up or just grown out so much in the greenhouse that these stems are so thick and the leaves are so thick that they're like a foot tall and they're still holding on to their upright growth habits. So I totally understand, but that's just more the reason why I have to talk about it today. So such an incredible houseplant, not as unusual as all the other ones I'm talking about today, I will admit, but still I think is just as deserving as a spot in today's video. And it's just such an easy houseplant to grow. I water this thing like every 2 weeks. In fact, I think I should really just give it a really good shower. It's been living inside that same terracotta planter in the same soil for like 3 years now. I think it could really use a good soak and a good clean off of the leaves. And next, let's talk about this guy. This is a really fun one. So this is a Pellionia pulchra, or Pellionia or pens, I don't know the exact name. I think this is most often gonna be sold on the market as a pulchra. And this has some really beautiful foliage. It also sports like a red color on the back. It's not as vibrant as some of the other houseplants that are known for having different colors on the back sides of their foliage, but I still appreciate it. It's just definitely not the star of the show. It's not one that you're dying to see the back of the houseplant, because the star of the show is the front of the foliage. It really does have some beautiful coloration to it. It does kind of shine in the light. This is more of a terrarium species, so this will need to acclimate a little bit more to your space, I would say. If this is provided with some extra humidity or like a glass enclosure or a terrarium, this thing will grow so robust, it's ridiculous. We used to just like shove them inside a glass and just forget about them back at the plant store, and we would find them just completely overgrown like a couple weeks later. This one I have not been growing inside an enclosure. I've been growing this on my kitchen counter, which is just receiving some like LED light. I don't even know if it's grow light, but it seems to work as a grow light. It was just like built into my cabinets. When I moved here, that's a different story, but I just wanted this to sit on my counter. I love the way it just kind of envelops the planter. And this is going to trail in a little bit of a different manner. It's going to be a little bit more tight, a little bit more aggressive. It's not going to just like hang in the way that some of the vining plants that we are used to do. Although I would argue that all of the plants that I'm talking about in today's video each hang in their own very particular manner, so this is just another one, to each their own. But since this is one that creeps a little bit more and stays a little bit more tight, instead of hanging it up, I've been really appreciating just having it sitting on my kitchen counter, since now that it's getting a little bit longer, it's beginning to creep along the surface of the counter. And since I have like a white counter, I like the way that this really dark foliage just stands out. That's also why I have it in a white planter, which you can barely see because it's practically enveloping the whole thing. The only thing about this houseplant, like I said, it does require more humidity, therefore also prefers a little bit more moisture as a terrarium species. So I do water it very often, but since I do have this right next to my sink, anytime I'm like dumping out a glass of water, I just go ahead and dump it in here. So it's been pretty happy with that. You will be able to upkeep it much better inside a glass enclosure or terrarium in comparison to outside, but it's still a fantastic houseplant to grow just in your home on a shelf or something like that. You just cannot forget about it. I've thrown them up on a wall before and forgotten for a couple of days to water these. Definitely more of behavior of a fern. They will crisp up and die. So just something to be mindful there, but I still have to talk about it today because it really is just such an incredible houseplant. And they're ridiculously common. You're most often going to find like small plants available in your terrarium selections at your local houseplant stores. You will also find them in larger planters. I've seen them pretty common in like the hanging basket selection at the big box stores that I go to. So very, very common houseplant, just one you might not even really notice. Last but most certainly not least, let's discuss this Dischidia right here. So this is on the market as Dischidia oeantha variegata. I have heard rumors that that is not the true name for this houseplant, but I don't know what the true name for this is, so we're just going to refer to it as its name. You're going to likely find it at your local houseplant stores. But this is just a really stunning trailing plant. I really have been getting into Dischidia over the last couple years, and finally they are growing for me. They take so long to grow. Like, I know I've had plenty of Hoyas that I'm like, they've done nothing for a couple years, but my success rate with Hoyas growing in the first year is tenfold in the comparison to my Dischidias. My Dischidias do not grow. They truly follow the adage that I always say: the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, the third year they leap. This one is just getting creeping. I know it's large and full and lush, but I purchased it just a little smaller than this. It's barely grown, just a little bit, like last year it grew a little bit, but I purchased this as this basket with this whole hanging apparatus. It was a pretty good deal. It was like 25 bucks, which honestly, I feel like most Dischidias this size would probably cost more, closer to $40, but I still think you could find a nice full pot of this Dischidia for like $10 to $20 at most houseplant stores. And like I said, this is one that's becoming much more available. This was one that was seldom going to be found at a houseplant store in like 2019, 2020, but I'd say as of like the past year or two, Dischidias have been coming in full force, which I really enjoy because they're such wonderful houseplants. They're very closely related to Hoyas and Ceropegias, which hit the market a little bit sooner than Dischidias. I completely understand though why it took so long for these to really hit the market, because I mean, I used to ask people when I worked in the industry, the people that I would buy from, why aren't Dischidias available, or why aren't there more Hoyas on the market? Because it really did take a while for these to really hit the market. And they would always tell me that it's just because they're such slow growing plants, that they take so long to root and to get growing, that they just don't find them as profitable as some other houseplants. So completely checks out. It's taking years for mine to grow, but I'm really happy that now they've hit the market, and I practically walk into every houseplant store these days and there's some type of Dischidia, and I'm always tempted to buy it, especially if I don't have it, but sometimes I'm like, Nick, just hold on to the ones you have. You got plenty. They're gonna start growing soon enough. Just wait. So you really have to be patient. Out of all of the houseplants I'm talking about today, you have to be very, very patient with these. Even though the Ripsalis were slow growing, I would say they grow like 3 times as fast as Dischidias. These really like to take their time, but they are just so gorgeous. The way they hang with like the 2 leaves every node, and just it's just like a waterfall of plant. It's so lush. It's so gorgeous. Really one of my favorite houseplants to grow. They've really come up for me a lot. And I'm just so thrilled that finally they're starting to grow for me. It's really been a long time. So thank you guys so much for joining me today, talking about 7 unusual, easy to find, inexpensive, trailing houseplants. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at PhillyFoliage, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys in my next video. Have a great day.